Today, Narendra Prasad sir is going to talk on colonial economy and its effects on princely states in first session, colonial economy and effects on princely states of Mysore in second session. So once again, I welcome Dr. Narendra Prasad sir. Thank you very much. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Shall we start?
Okay, sir. You start ಮಾಡಿ sir. ಜಾಯ್ನ್ ಆಗೋರು ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರಲಿ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೋಸ್ಕರ ಕಾಯೋದು ಬೇಡ. It's our time.
Today I will be engaging you two sessions. First session I will be dealing with colonialism, its definition, and I tell you in the beginning itself, I cannot come to a clear-cut definition of colonialism. And in the second session, I'll be dealing with the impact of colonialism on princely states, with a more particular reference to the area which I know more, that is princely state of Mysore, also called Mysore state, also referred to as province of Mysore. I think most of you have gone through today's newspaper. Yesterday, in Australia, in the city of Canberra, Australia was a former colony of Great Britain. I think it was in 1901, Dominion status was granted to Canada. 1901. Yesterday, Charles, he had visited Canada, or he is on a tour in Canada and neighboring islands. There was a function in Canberra yesterday. That is what newspapers have reported. Soon after the speech of Charles, an indigenous member of a tribal group, and it's interesting, she's a woman who is also a member of Australian Parliament. In the midst of those persons who were present in the function, she is reported to have spoken for nearly 5 minutes, arguing about the effects of colonialism on Canada. She criticized English colonialism on Canada, and she is said to have taken to the maximum extent, saying that colonialism has killed Australia, has killed Australians, has impoverished Canada. This is nearly after 75 years. I think it was in 1972, United Nations General Assembly, it took a decision saying that colonialism is anti-people. Anti-people. That was a decision taken by United Nations General Assembly in 1972. With this brief background, I will give you I told you that I am not in a position to give you a clear-cut definition about colonialism. Its beginning, its spread, and its impact on geopolitical region. In 19th century, India was a prime colony of Great Britain. Particularly from 1757, that is from the day on which Battle of Plassey took place till 1857, colonialism had its impact on Indian society. Then the company was English East India Company. See, there is a definition about colonialism. Colonialism refers to the domination of one country over another country or people. Colonialism is a domination of one country over another country or people. I think this is the best definition of colonialism we have so far. And secondly, colonialism can be connected, or colonialism, the word itself, has generic relations with another word, imperialism. So colonialism and imperialism, they follow, or they are something like parallel, and later we have nationalism. So naturally, when we speak about the emergence of national consciousness in different colonial world, geopolitical regions, we prefer to call it as colonialism, followed by imperialism, followed by as a quiet reaction to both these two, that is the spirit of nationalism. So hence colonialism and imperialism are used interchangeably, but there are fundamental differences between these two concepts. During the 17th century, when colonies were established, there were two types of colonies which were established. One was colonies of settlement, because in the late 16th and early part of 17th century in Europe, because of several pressures found within European countries, a large number of people, they preferred to migrate outside Europe. Naturally, they decided to cross over Atlantic Ocean and went in search of those places. And in those places, they established their colonies, and in those colonies, they settled. That is colonies of settlement. Second is colonies of exploitation. There is difference between colonies of settlement and colonies of exploitation. Many scholars who have studied and done research on impact of colonialism, they have identified three important words, WORDS: gold, gold, God, and glory. You know, rather we know, what is the meaning of gold? God we know, and glory. So these three G's, gold, God, and glory, these are the three fundamental words which motivated several European countries to establish colonies of both the types, that is colonies of settlement and colonies of exploitation. As days passed on, there was an understanding between the economic purposes of the colonies, both types of colonies, and religious purpose of both types of colonies. For example, most of the European countries, which were in one sense or the other colonial powers, they became colonial powers. They had colonies outside Europe. They had established colonies for the settlements of their own people. They had established colonies of exploitation, which also was a resident of their own people. You know, English colonialism, we call it as English colonialism because it began or it had its influence on India. Similarly, French colonialism we have, Dutch colonialism we have, Italian colonialism we have, Spanish colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, Italian colonialism, Swedish colonialism. This kind of colonialism had its impact. One of the great historians that India had produced, Dr. Bipan Chandra, he gives us another definition about colonialism. I quote, colonialism is a system of domination. I repeat, colonialism is a system of domination, exploitation, and underdevelopment of one society by another. This is a simple sentence which we can identify several factors which are hidden in this sentence. He says that it is domination of several characters: economic domination, political domination, social domination, cultural domination, exploitation. Once again, all the different categories and underdevelopment of one society by another. So here, society becomes important. One society is being dominated by another society. So a society which is dominating another society, a society which is coming under the domination of one society, that becomes an alien society or a foreign society or exported society. And the society which is being dominated, it becomes indigenous society, native society. I'll go to the next stage. Scholars have identified different stages of colonialism. By studying the different stages of colonialism, most of the scholars, both Indian and European, they have identified the different stages of economic exploitation which many societies underwent. For example, make a note of it. From 1753 to, from 1757 to 1813, I'm talking about Indian situation. From 1757 to 1813. I think most of you know the importance of these 2 years. 1757, Battle of Plassey. 1813 is the year in which Charter Acts were promulgated in India. This period is usually referred to as the period of monopoly trade. Period of monopoly trade. Second stage, from 1813 to 1858, it is called the period of free trade. 1813 to 1858. Stage number 3, or the third stage, is an era of foreign investment. In most of the colonies, or most of the colonial geopolitical regions, I think all these, they underwent these 3 different stages, where they had a monopolistic trade in the first stage. Secondly, there was the presence of free trade, and the last stage was foreign investment, where capital was pumped or capital investment function took place in many different colonial regions. Taking into consideration, we have to understand what is this economic domination. Domination, I told you earlier, it was a domination of several varieties. We have to understand the importance of economic domination in the beginning. That is, economic domination also refers to the economic exploitation or the level of economic exploitation which all these colonies underwent. Secondly, political domination. Number 3 is social domination. Number 4 is cultural domination. So economic, political, social, and cultural. I think you have heard the name of a historian. He was not a historian, but being an anthropologist, he became more famous as an historian. Bernard S. Cohn, C-O-H-N. He uses the term colonial knowledge. He uses the term colonial knowledge. This colonial knowledge refers to the knowledge in the form of published reports of commissions, official proceedings, colonial regulations, legal codes, and statistical data of finance, trade, demography, crime, education, transportation, agriculture, and industry. My understanding is that to understand colonialism, we should have an idea about this colonial knowledge. See, for example, when Bernard S. Cohn highlighted these points, he did this in the background that all these were used as tools of power and control over colonies. Whatever the aspects I referred earlier, published colonial knowledge, they were used by colonial powers as tools of power. We can call it as mechanisms. There are many ways of domination. To dominate one society or one colony, either you should have mechanisms of power or you should have tools of power. So mechanisms and tools, they are one and the same. And in this respect, I think we can call colonialism is a state of economic and political control. Colonialism is a state of economic and political control. And this state of economic and political control, it saturated, came down to India in two different ways. One was a direct way, another was indirect way. Hence, we call it as indirect colonial situation and direct colonial situation. Let us go back to Europe now. 4 countries, they began to have the control over geopolitical regions outside Europe for many reasons. For example, Spain, we have Spanish Empire, Holland, Dutch Empire, France, French Empire, and England, British Empire. All these four countries, gradually, they built their empire. It is called colonial empire. In Europe, they had their own empires. But outside Europe, there are different geopolitical regions which were under their control. They became part and parcel of their empire. So outside Europe, they established their colonies, which became part and parcel of their empire. I'll go to the next stage. For example, why they wanted to have these colonies? To secure safety and property of merchants engaged in colonial trade. Most of these countries, they were not basically trading communities. For example, Spanish Empire was built on the basis of three important words: gold, glory, and God. France, they wanted to have glory because gold had taken over by Spain. Holland and England, they depended much on trade. So they wanted to provide a safety and property of the merchants engaged in colonial trade. That was the reason why these four countries, they built a colonial empire. Secondly, to exclude competition of foreign merchants. See, wherever they established colonies, in those colonies, they developed trade. So, to secure more profit from the trade in these colonial areas, they wanted to build a society where their trade is not affected by local merchants. I think you understand this. Their trade is not affected by the trading characteristics of the local traders or in the colonies. Number three is regulate the terms of trade between the mother country and the colony. I am using these two words, mother country and the colony. Now, mother country is from where colonial power emerged, or from where colonialism as a distinct culture began to flow. It emerged from these mother countries. For example, in colonial days, I think our forefathers, they called Great Britain mother country. Now we call Mother India. In Latin America, those people who came under the control of Spain, they called Spain or Spanish Empire as Mother Empire. In Southeast Asia, people, they talked about Dutch. They called the Dutch Empire as their Mother Empire. Likewise, it continues. We will take up the characteristic features of the first stage, that is from 1757 to 1813. This is this was a crucial period in the history of India. Right from the day on which Battle of Plassey took place till the promulgation of the Charter Act in 1813. It was the period of direct plunder of wealth. Direct plunder of wealth determines the continuous economic exploitation which was mechanically operated. It was a continuous economic exploitation. During this period, English East India Company it was more dominant. There were no competitors for the English East India Company during this period, except for the French, who were active in certain pockets in South India and some coastal area, where English East India Company, they established a monopoly over the trade which they had with the Indian colonies. During this period, the English East India Company had two objectives, important objectives. One, acquire a monopoly trade with India. They wanted to have a monopolistic trade in India. Added to this, they brought in the second feature. They wanted to acquire political power. So in India, colonialism began with economic exploitation, later turned to be a political motive. So economy and politics, they are very much interlinked during this period. During this period, English East India Company, it was not at all bothered about changes to be introduced in India, because it was not its intention to bring in changes in India. Its only intention was to have a trade, monopolistic trade, acquire more wealth, make more profit from trade with Indian colonies, and during this period, no basic changes were introduced in the colony. During the second stage, that is from 1813 to 1858, this period is crucial, not only in the history of Europe, but also in the history of India. You know, 19th century history of India, we have a problem in understanding 19th century India. We try to understand the history of India of 19th century in the context of 19th century developments which are taking place in India. And those contexts, they had a historical background of the same time at contemporary Europe in 19th century India. This is one interesting feature, that you cannot simply understand colonialism in India without referring to the developments which are taking place in contemporary India. Many of us are under the impression that colonialism can be understood without referring to Europe of 19th century Europe. It becomes a historical. For example, 19th century India, there were many empires. 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte. Go back to the history of early second decade of the 19th century. After the downfall of Napoleon Bonaparte, there was Concert of Europe, Vienna Congress. And the countries which had participated in Vienna Congress, they had one important aspect before them. That was how to maintain balance of power. You know, this is the concept of international relations. England participated, France participated, and in the concept of, in the background of international, maintaining international balance, maintaining the status quo of international balance, we have to understand that it was also the period of brisk industrial development taking place in contemporary Europe. It was the period of industrial revolution. 1750 to 1850 is generally referred to as the period of era of industrial progress, where machines were invented. And machines which were invented, they were made to work or replace human labor. So when machines were invented and they were made to replace the human labor, there was unexpected growth of production in industries in Europe. And those industrial outlets, industrial production houses, they were in need of a huge amount of raw material. And unfortunately, industries in Europe, they lagged behind in providing raw materials to industrial houses in Europe, particularly in England. And the demands of the industries in England, one demand they had, one agenda they had, continuous supply of raw material to their industries. And during this period, the second stage of colonialism in India, it deals with the supply of raw material to English industries. That was from 1813 to 1858. This was the heyday of English East India Company. During this period, development in correspondence with the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, that has to be understood very clearly. Industries in England during that time, it developed because of there was a chain linkage between industrial production and the supply of raw material from India, prime colony of English East India Company. And point number 3, this period is also referred to as, personally I feel, also referred to as the classical age of free trade. Free trade. Free trade doesn't mean that people are getting every commodity free of charge. It was a free trade. English East India Company had established its monopoly over free trade. It has established its monopoly over carrying of raw materials from India, supplying it to Indian industries in England, buying the finished product from industries in Great Britain, ferrying back it to India, selling it. East India Company made a huge amount of wealth during this period because of its two qualities, buying and selling, buyers and sellers. They were also buyers, they were also sellers, they were supplier of raw material. They, to have their control over vast resources, they decided to expand their political control. Hence, this was also the period of expansion of political control of Great Britain in India. Anglo-Maratha War, 1818. That came as a blessing in disguise to the English East India Company. Because of that, they had brought under the control huge resources. They had brought under control vast geopolitical region which produced natural resources. Fortunately, those natural resources, they were converted into raw materials for the industries in England. And this classical age of free trade, and India became a part of the classical age of free trade of English East India Company. In the meantime, point number 3, that should be understood very clearly. English East India Company, they converted these huge natural resources rich geopolitical regions into expansive markets where industrial products of England were to be sold for the Indian consumers. The expansion of market, free trade, that was a characteristic feature of free trade expansion of man. For example, textiles. They also needed from India exports of raw materials, especially cotton and food grain. We have a list of commodities which were being shipped to England from India during this time. Cotton seeds we have, raw cotton we have, jute we have, gold we have. By that time, gold had lost its value because there was no scope for the gold in English industries. Gold was kept as a reserve. So Bank of England, it gave prominence to gold to be kept as reserve, and that interest or the capital accumulated on the reserve gold kept in Bank of England was to be utilized as capital for industries in England. Hope I am not confusing you. See, the intricacies of colonialism, it had two impacts on India during this stage, second stage. India became a vast market. Hope you understand this. India became a vast market for the colonial products during this period. Secondly, English East India Company, which had created a huge and expansive market in India, that market came to be exploited by English East India Company. See, they created market. Second stage, they started exploiting the market which they created earlier. And India became a continuous supplier of raw materials for India. This is the characteristic features of colonialism during this period. And to help their industrial production, to help their trade, English East India Company, they removed, exempted import duties on all essential commodities. Number three is financial restrictions or restrictions on the exchange of commodities. And they also reduced normal duties which were otherwise imposed on the exchange of commodities. And number four is India became, or it was thrown open to British manufacturing industries. When India became a market for open market for British industrial products, there was no need for the English East India Company to support the growth of industries in India. This point is highlighted by many economic historians or historians of India as the policy of deindustrialization. They never supported any industries in India. And there was free entry of commodities from England then, where a owner of an industry in Great Britain, he was also the person who sold his products to Indian markets. The same person or his association or his society In India, they invested their capital. For example, in Bengal and in Bombay Presidency, there were many instances where industrial capital houses, they had also invested in small industrial houses in India, in trading houses in India. And most interestingly, at that time, this shipping industry, shipping, because during this time, no development had taken place in railway transport communication. So, large number of people, they also invested in shipping industry. They invested in trade, and they also made huge investments on plantations, particularly in northeastern part of India, Bengal. And the relation between English East India Company and these capitalists, for example, they directly supported this kind of investment functions which took place during this period, the second stage of colonialism. And they also had their impact on agrarian structure situation. Now, India during this time was basically an agrarian country. And except in small holdings of agrarian structure, the English had invested in plantations. But because of this, there was a gradual decline in industrial agricultural products. And the most interesting thing is that during this period, second stage of colonialism, we have phenomenal increase in import and export activities during this time. And this had its impact on trade. Much support was given to trade. English East India Company, it helped in the establishment of steamship navigation companies. We have statistics. And during this time also, after 1854, when the first train checked out in Great Britain, attempts were made to construct a railway transport system in India. I think it was in 1854, the first railway communication system was developed in Bombay, connecting Bombay and Borivandar. That was in 1854. And company officials, they were also interested in investing construction of railway transportation system. And as gradually when this went on, English East India Company decided that it should concentrate on consolidation of these natural resources into political unity. Directly to tell you that by 1850, English East India Company had brought under its control nearly 2/3 of India. And 1/3 remained under the direct political control of Maharajas and princes. That was called as Indian India, and this 2/3 was called as English India. And during this period, administration was percolated. Percolated in the sense it came down from top. Something like a decoction, coffee decoction. Put boil water, we get decoction in the bowl. It percolated from top above, downstream went, and the first thing during this time, English East India Company that was also an impact of colonialism. Take a note of it. That was the most important thing. Judiciary or system of judicial administration came to be influenced by this colonial type of administration. Judiciary. Judicial system came to be revived thoroughly. There was a thorough reunification or readjustment of judiciary. And this judiciary adjustment, what it began above, came down. Judicial terms came to be replaced with native language terminologies. For example, Farsi came to be replaced by English language. Between 1830 and 40, during the same period, English language came to be replaced by Parsi language. You know, they had an aversion about Parsi language because they considered that it was language of the Mughals. Though it was not officially the language of the Mughals, they thought that Farsi, being a classical language in 19th century, it was to be replaced, or there was much scope for the English East India Company to replace it with English. And the second system which they introduced was, they introduced a modern system of education that is called a colonial system of education. We call it, in simple words, English education. That was introduced in 1835, the same period. As per or as analyzed by historians, the introduction of Western education was, or it had many impacts on Indian society, or there were many reasons for its introduction. They wanted to unify India, number one. They wanted to introduce one system of education, one system of administration, one system of judiciary. So they thought that they should start introducing, or they should introduce English education, and after 1835, English East India Company gave much scope for the spread of, or gradual spread of English education. It had its impact on Indian society. Let us take into consideration economic exploitation, political exploitation, judicial exploitation, and cultural exploitation, social exploitation through the means of introduction of English education. And one important reason, as noted by another historian, modern education was meant to generate a culture of loyalty to the rulers. They wanted to have more number of people who were more loyal to the administration. They thought that English educated would be more loyal because the government had provided them education. And this had its impact, gradual impact in the change in the social structure. There was a change in the social structure. There was also a change in the social conditions, which had their impact on minute social conditions. And after 1840, English East India Company, as a part and parcel of implications of colonial rule, they launched a propaganda against the traditional character of Indian society. No, 19th century, whatever the empires we take, for example, we are talking about English Empire. They had questioned the existing and traditional characteristic features of colonial society in India. Hence, they wanted to introduce certain changes. Not certain changes, they wanted to introduce certain drastic changes to be introduced in Indian society. The same thing happened in Latin America and Spanish Empire. We have seen what happened on the west coast of India when certain pockets were under the control of Portuguese Empire. We have seen what happened in certain pockets area in South India during the second half of the 17th and early part of 18th century when French Empire had its control. So, naturally, the percolation of social changes were to be brought. English colonial interest, they thought that, or they considered that whatever they considered as traditional in India, I am giving you an important point. That was the real stage during that period. Whatever they considered as traditional in India during the second half of the 19th century, they thought that or they considered it as barbaric. Hope I am using the correct word, barbaric. Those who follow those barbaric ideas, they considered them as uncivilized. And to put it in exact meaning of the contemporary second half of the 19th century English democracy, English East India Company, they thought that they should introduce certain democratic ideas in India, which is undemocratic. Hope I have confused. I'm not confused. They thought that they should introduce certain changes in undemocratic colonies to democratize them. They also considered that existing religious conditions, faith, belief, and the existing and prevalent systems as barbaric. Particularly, they made a harsh criticism about the Hindu way of life. They also criticized gradually after 1857 the Islamic jurisprudence, Islamic law and faith. And this gave much scope for the Christian missionaries to become more proactive in India during the time of the second stage of colonialism during this time. A large amount of money was spent on administrative structure during this time. By 1850, the English East India Company had denounced or it has stopped giving much encouragement to trading practices. In fact, it wanted to deviate its attention more towards administration. As and when more deviation was given to administration, there was a gradual increase in administrative expenditure. To keep the administration safe, English East India Company it wanted to have an army stationed in India. So the payment to be made to the army, their dearness allowance, washing allowances, transport allowances, conveyance, everything was to be maintained by the government of the English East India Company. Expansion of the army took place, and their salary and other expenses, works were to be maintained by the. All these, they were done during this period. And I think I have just 7 minutes left for the conclusion. In this 7 minutes, I'll be dealing roughly with the third stage of colonialism. That was an era of foreign investment. During this period, that is after 1858 onwards, when nearly 2/3 of India was called as British India and 1/3 of India was Indian India, by this time, presidencies had emerged. Bombay Presidency, Madras Presidency, Bengal Presidency. There were several presidencies. They had given much importance to trade, and government of India had become part and parcel of the British Empire. And politically and administratively, India had been undergone the last stage of colonialism during this period. And most of the colonial administrators during this period, they thought that colonial administration should reach every nook and corner of India. Nook and corner of India. Whether it's a direct colonial administration or indirect colonial administration. And in most of the princely states, there was an indirect colonial situation, and majority of the geopolitical regions, they were brought under direct colonial situation. So we call it as colonial India, one part, and Indian India, the other part. I will finish this. If you have any questions to ask, you can ask me. Now it is 11 o'clock. At 11, I have stopped. 11 to 11:15, we will have questions.
Good morning, sir.
Please. Khaja Mohiddin, yes. Where are you from?
Sir, I am from Government Arts College for Men, Krishnagiri, sir.
Krishnagiri, Tamil. Okay, tell me.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your lucid presentation of the team, sir. And my question comes from first stage of colonialism. You are, yes, sir. You are referring to the period of direct plunder of wealth.
Okay.
In this context, can you tell us what are the different methods and means by which the British East India Company and its servants, bureaucracy, plundered India, as the book by Nicholas Dirks, The Scandal of Empire?
That's good. Okay. Okay.
That's one question, and the second question is
shall I
regarding
answer the first question now? Because I don't.
Yes.
If I don't forget.
Yes, sir. Yes.
The plundering is mechanically systematic plundering. Plundering through trade, plundering to uneven trade. Trade, you know. Uneven trade is something like Hawala trade. Okay. And exploitation is not trade, but they exploit it through trade. Trade is different from exploitation. Trade is a means to exploitation. That is what Bernard Escon says. Secondly, whatever or whoever civil administrator or army officials, generals, or sipais for that matter from British origin who stayed over in India, they made it a point to carry wealth from India. See, it is a new place, and these people, they have come from nearly 8,000 kilometers away. They came here, they saw here, they conquered here. I came, I saw, and conquered. See, for example, I have read, or many books have highlighted this point. Whoever came to India as an official of English East India Company, they carried a huge amount of wealth to India, to England. So trade is different, exploitation is different. And the third is plundering. I think you know the difference between plundering and exploitation. Plunder, there is some force is involved. Exploitation, there is involved indirect and direct plundering. So plundering is also called exploitation. And huge amount of wealth. This is what Dadabhai Naoroji, in his classical work, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, he explained a drain of wealth. I think you have heard this concept, drain of wealth. R.C. Dutt refers to this. Gopal Krishna Gokhale refers to this. Bal Gangadhar Tilak refers to this. Even Mahatma Gandhi ji refers to this. And many historians who worked on late 19th and early part of 20th century, they made it a point to understand the economic conditions of India of 19th century through this angle, drain of wealth. When wealth is drained out in more quantity and quality, you mean to say that India remains rich. Now the second question.
What is white man's burden, sir?
White man's burden is, what is white, tell me?
Europeans, here particularly the British man, when you are referring to the barbaric kind
Okay,
in
who
second,
are we? Who are we in that sense? I am
so
black.
according,
I am black. See, I am black, you are black. All the people who are
brown hair.
Brown, black, brown and black, they start with alphabet B. White. White man's burden is a racial terminology. They thought that white man ruled efficiently. So they thought that white man's burden, their burden is more in India because their responsibility is here is more to civilize the uncivilized Indians who are black in color.
Evangelist thought.
It is not evangelist thought. It is not evangelist thought. It is a racial policy of discrimination. And you know the white man's burden, the great poem written by whom?
Rudyard Kipling.
Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling.
Clip.
Rudyard Kipling, he wrote the famous poem. And most of the Indian writers in English, they consider this poem as anti-racial. Okay, any questions?
Good morning, sir.
Please.
Good morning, sir.
Who is that? Prakash.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I'm Gopal, Government Prasad College opening day.
Where are you? What is your
name? How to develop colonial knowledge and utilize in India?
Where are you?
Gopal.
What is your name?
From Upinangadi.
What is your name? Hello.
Government Prasad College.
I asked
Gopal,
your name,
sir.
not the college. Gopal. You are not in the screen. Okay.
Gopal.
Okay. What is your question?
Government Prasad College Upinangadi.
I want to know your question, please. Question, please.
Sir, Gopal, Government Prasad College Upinangadi.
Okay. Question.
Sir, Britishers how developed colonial knowledge and utilized in India?
See, for example, in 19th century.
How to develop colonial
Okay, I'll come
knowledge?
to, I understood your question. The beginning of the
In
19th
India.
century, when English East India Company, they started establishing their political hold over geographical regions. They took up
Sir,
three
how
important
to
things.
develop colonial knowledge in
Okay,
India?
okay. I will tell you. I am telling you the answer. In the beginning of the 19th century, the English, they commissioned several people to make a survey of those geographical regions which they had acquired. Survey. Because they wanted to know more about the geographical regions. They wanted to know more about those regions, their language, their habits, their traditions, their customs, their religious faith, their belief in the religious faith, their food habits, and in total, a survey about these geographical regions began to take place. For example, I think you have heard the name of Francis Hamilton Buchanan, who came to princely Mysore for a survey. He later published his report in the form of 3 huge volumes to British English East India Company, a journey to the provinces of Mysore, Malabar, and Madras. So, the English East India Company officials, they utilized these survey reports for their future prospects. Any other question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Uh, First of all, I express my gratitude to you, sir. It
What is
was
your
very
name? Where are
yes,
you?
sir. I am Dr. Gahininath Shelke, Department of History, New Arts, Commerce and Science College, Shevgaon, District, Ahmednagar, from Maharashtra, sir.
Okay.
Okay, sir. It was very informative and knowledgeable lectures, and you have put before us some new points, sir. Actually, I have a question regarding the extension of British East India Company, the trade with India, with monopoly rights. Actually, before the 1813 Chartered Act, British East India Company had monopoly right to trade with India. Why the other capitalists or traders have had not to trade with India or East Indies companies? And after then, what happened? With the extension of British East India Company, become a political ruler, and other investors and capitalists got to right to invest in India, to trade with India or East India companies.
See, during the first stage, English East India Company had a trade or a monopolistic trade. They wanted to have a trade and expand it by imposing a monopoly over its trade activities. Secondly, we have studies done on the preference given by traders of English East India Company to have more trade relations with Indian traders. At the same time, they also obstructed Indian traders having their trade relations with the other foreign companies like French and the Dutch. Whereas in Europe, English East India Company traders, they had trade relations with the traders in Holland. They had relations with traders in France, but not in this colony. This is the characteristic features of Indian colonialism. I think I have answered your question.
Actually, I read. Actually, I not remember where I read it. the Napoleon Bonaparte, the policy of Napoleon Bonaparte, and he called one European conference in 1804, 1806, two conference he called, and in that he deny uh, the British East India traders to trade with other European countries where Napoleon Bonaparte had their rule over that area. So after then, the investor or traders demanded to British Parliament uh, to have a right to trade with East India companies.
Yeah.
Actually, I have not remember where I read it.
Okay. Understand your question. I try to answer this. The main intention of Napoleon Bonaparte was not to have trade. His motive was to expand the French Empire through control over Mediterranean Sea, Egypt, Persia, and India. He wanted to repeat what the early Roman emperors had done long back. And most of the European rulers then, they wanted to repeat whatever the early Roman emperors had done in the beginning.